In the quiet suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, Catherine Harris and her husband David seemed to embody the perfect American family. They had 2 beautiful children, a lovely home tucked away on a peaceful street, and lives that appeared to be picture-perfect from the outside. Neighbors waved as they drove past, always complimenting their well-maintained lawn and the white picket fence that surrounded their yard. To the world, they were a symbol of success, love, and stability. But behind the smiles and seemingly flawless life, something darker was quietly taking root. Catherine was a woman who had spent most of her life dedicated to others. A high school teacher, she shaped the minds of young students with patience and care. Her world revolved around her family, her children, her husband, the small, everyday moments that brought them together. She believed in their love, trusted in the vows they had made to one another. For better or for worse, she would tell herself, always holding on to that promise. But life, as it often does, had other plans. In late 2017, Catherine was diagnosed with breast cancer. The news hit like a freight train, shattering the quiet rhythm of their daily life. She had always been a fighter, but the reality of her diagnosis forced her into a new battle, one she was not sure she could win. Weeks turned into months, each one bringing a new round of chemotherapy, surgeries, and a never-ending stream of doctor's appointments. Her once vibrant, healthy body was being slowly, methodically destroyed by the treatments meant to save her life. Through it all, Catherine found herself depending more and more on David. He was the one who helped her get out of bed in the mornings when the weight of her illness made it impossible to do so on her own. He was supposed to be her rock, her partner in this fight. But the closer she got to him, the more she felt his distance grow. It started with small signs, missed calls, late nights at work, excuses that didn't add up. At first, Catherine brushed it off. He was under stress, working long hours to support their family during her illness. She told herself that it was the weight of the situation bearing down on him, too. But as the months went by, the cracks in their marriage became impossible to ignore. David, a successful corporate executive, had always been busy with work. But now, those late nights seemed to stretch on endlessly. He would come home late, his mind clearly elsewhere, as if he were a stranger slipping in and out of their home. He no longer kissed her forehead the way he used to, no longer asked about her day. Catherine began to feel a coldness between them, a silence that she couldn't explain. He had always been there for her, at least that's what she thought, but now, when she needed him most, he was slipping away. There were nights when Catherine lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the harsh light of the moon casting long shadows across the room. She would reach out to him, but his back was always turned. She would hear his steady breathing, but it was as if he were miles away, living in another world. She couldn't understand it. The pain of her illness was immense, but the emotional distance between them felt like a wound of its own. But Catherine, ever the optimist, refused to believe that their marriage was crumbling. She held on to the hope that once her treatments were over, once her body had healed, everything would go back to normal. She kept telling herself that things would get better. But deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. And it wasn't until the cold, rainy afternoon of March 10, 2020, that she would finally uncover the truth. Before the storm of illness hit, Catherine and David Harris were like any other family living the American dream. Their house, nestled in a leafy suburb of Charlotte, was more than just a home, it was a reflection of their success and hard work. The walls were adorned with family portraits, and the dining table was often filled with laughter during evening meals. David, with his impeccable career, and Catherine, the nurturing teacher, seemed to have it all. Their life was defined by its routines, school drop-offs, family movie nights, and weekends spent tending to the garden or enjoying lazy afternoons at the park. It was the kind of life everyone admired from the outside. Catherine had always prided herself on her role as the heart of their family. She had shaped her life around her children and husband, constantly striving to create a warm, stable environment for them. In her eyes, family was everything. She was the kind of woman who went above and beyond to ensure that everyone around her felt loved and supported. David, on the other hand, was driven and ambitious. He worked long hours at his high-powered job, a position that required frequent travel and late nights. Yet, he always found time for their children, coaching their little league games or attending their school performances. Together, they were a picture of balance, a family that worked hard but played harder. As a couple, they celebrated milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, and countless other moments that marked the passage of time. Their marriage, in Catherine's eyes, had weathered the ups and downs of life. They had built a life together that was stable, full of love and mutual respect. The two of them had always been a team, David providing for their family with his career, and Catherine creating the nurturing, loving home that they both treasured. Catherine never once doubted their commitment to each other. But as with all relationships, the undercurrents of daily life began to subtly shift. What began as small, imperceptible changes would soon evolve into something Catherine could no longer ignore. These changes, though slight at first, left Catherine feeling unsettled, though she had no concrete reason to be alarmed. David's late nights at the office, his sudden need to go on business trips that seemed unnecessary, the excuses that didn't quite add up, they all blended together in a way that felt wrong, yet unspoken. Still, Catherine had always trusted David. After all, he was her partner, the father of their children, the man she had built a life with. She reassured herself that it was simply the pressure of his demanding job. Work had always been his focus, but they had been through tough times before, and they had always come out stronger. Their relationship had survived the early years of parenting, their struggles with finances when they first started out, and the constant balancing act of careers and family. They had always made it work. But slowly, as time wore on, Catherine began to realize that the cracks she had ignored for months were now becoming too obvious to overlook. She began to feel an unfamiliar tension whenever they were alone. David no longer seemed to find time for their quiet moments together. He no longer kissed her goodnight or asked her about her day. He had once been so attuned to her, always there to offer comfort after a tough day, but now, his attentiveness seemed forced, like it was an obligation rather than an expression of love. Catherine had always been a woman of strength, and she prided herself on being self-sufficient. But now, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to admit the truth, she felt the walls of their relationship growing colder. She found herself withdrawing into herself, unsure of what to do with the growing suspicion that there was more going on than David was letting on. She had been the anchor of their family for so long, but now, she found herself adrift, uncertain of where to turn. And then, in late 2017, just as Catherine was beginning to feel the weight of her own inner conflict, everything changed. The doctor's visits that had once been routine for family checkups now became a blur of tests and scans. The news was delivered quickly, almost casually: Catherine had breast cancer. In an instant, the life they had built together was turned upside down. Catherine's world, once so certain and stable, now felt like it was crumbling, and as she was thrust into the battle for her life, she began to feel more alone than ever before. David's response, at first, was exactly what Catherine expected. He promised to be by her side, to support her through this difficult time. But as the days wore on, Catherine found herself in a growing sea of uncertainty, not just about her health, but about her marriage. The cracks, once small and barely noticeable, now seemed to grow wider with each passing day. It was as if the illness had revealed more than just Catherine's physical weakness, it had exposed the weaknesses in her relationship with David. And as her body began to fail her, Catherine began to question whether the love she had always believed was unconditional had begun to wither away as well. The mounting pressure of her illness, combined with the emotional distance between her and David, forced Catherine into a corner. She no longer felt like she was part of a team, she felt like she was fighting alone. But what was the cause of this sudden rift? Was it the stress of the illness, or something deeper, something Catherine could not yet see? The answer was about to come, but it would not be one she was ready to face. Her fight for survival had just begun, but it was also the beginning of another battle, one she never imagined she would have to face. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap, shattering Catherine's world in a way she could never have prepared for. In late 2017, after weeks of tests, scans, and endless waiting, Catherine was told that she had breast cancer. The words felt foreign in her ears, their weight impossible to grasp. Cancer. It was a word she had never imagined would be part of her life, let alone something she would have to face head-on. Yet there she was, a woman in her 40s, suddenly thrust into a battle for her life. The first days were a blur, doctor's appointments, second opinions, making sense of the endless stream of medical terms. It all felt like a whirlwind, like someone had ripped the fabric of her life apart. But what took the longest to sink in was the toll it would take on her body. The chemotherapy treatments were grueling, draining her physically, emotionally, and mentally. Her once vibrant body, a symbol of health and strength, was now weak, pale, and fragile. The long days spent in a hospital chair, the harsh chemicals coursing through her veins, and the toll it all took on her appearance left her feeling as if she were a shadow of the person she had once been. Her hair, thick and chestnut-colored, fell out in clumps, leaving her staring at a reflection that was increasingly unfamiliar. Her once glowing skin became pallid, her energy drained to the point where getting out of bed felt like a monumental effort. David, her husband, had promised to be by her side through all of it. He reassured her that they would face it together, just like they had faced every challenge in their lives. He told her that no matter what, they would get through it. But as the weeks went on, Catherine began to notice subtle changes in his behavior, changes that made her question the very foundation of their relationship. At first it was small things, missed phone calls, him staying late at the office more often than usual, a certain coldness in his responses. Catherine, overwhelmed by her own health struggles, brushed it off. He was busy, she reasoned. He was under stress, juggling his demanding career while trying to be supportive at home. But soon, the cracks in their relationship became too obvious to ignore. She couldn't understand why the man who had once been so attentive, who had always been there to hold her hand through the hardest times, was now distant. He no longer kissed her forehead the way he used to, no longer asked about her day. Their conversations had grown shorter, more strained. Even when they were in the same room, Catherine felt like they were oceans apart. She couldn't help but feel the coldness between them, an invisible wall that had started to rise. And with each passing day, as she grew weaker from the treatment, her dependence on David grew, but so did her sense of isolation. There were nights when she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of David's breathing beside her. It should have been a comfort, but instead, it felt like a reminder of the distance between them. When he would reach for her, it felt like an obligation rather than an act of love. She no longer felt the warmth of their bond, she felt as though she were clinging to a ghost of the man she had married. Every touch, every word, seemed laced with the unspoken tension that had begun to simmer between them. Catherine wanted to believe that things would improve, that once her treatment was over, everything would go back to normal. She clung to that hope, despite the growing doubts in the back of her mind. She wanted to believe that David was just overwhelmed by the pressure of her illness, that he was doing his best to support her in his own way. But with each passing day, the question kept nagging at her, was it just stress, or was there something more going on? It wasn't until March 10, 2020, that Catherine would finally uncover the painful truth that had been hiding in plain sight. On that day, Catherine, tired and frustrated with her sense of growing suspicion, decided to take a step that would change everything. David had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he took a shower, and something about the way it kept vibrating caught her attention. She knew she shouldn't pry. David had always been a private person when it came to his phone, but something deep within her urged her to unlock it. She hadn't expected to find anything. She thought, perhaps, she was just being paranoid. But as she scrolled through the messages on his screen, Catherine's heart dropped into her stomach. There, in black and white, were explicit text messages between David and Lily Ford, their neighbor, a woman who was everything Catherine was not at that moment: young, healthy, full of life. Catherine felt as if the world around her was closing in. It wasn't just that David had cheated, it was the betrayal of it all. The messages were intimate, personal, and filled with things Catherine thought she had shared only with him. The laughter, the promises, the sweet words, they were all there, shared between David and Lily, while Catherine lay bedridden, fighting for her life. Catherine's chest tightened as she read through the messages, the weight of the betrayal nearly suffocating her. She couldn't even cry. The tears, if they came, felt frozen inside her. She was numb. In the weeks that followed, she found herself replaying their entire marriage in her mind, trying to make sense of the signs she had missed. She questioned every moment, every interaction, wondering how she could have been so blind to the truth. But there was no comfort in looking back, only the brutal reality that the man she had loved, the man she had stood by for years, had chosen someone else while she fought for her life. The rage that began to build inside her was slow, like a fire smoldering beneath the surface, but it was fierce. Catherine had always prided herself on being strong, but now, in the face of this devastation, her strength began to shift. It wasn't just about surviving cancer anymore, it was about surviving this betrayal, this crushing blow to the very core of her identity. She was no longer just the sick wife who needed David's support. She was someone else now, someone with a purpose, someone who had been wronged and would not let it go unpunished. The battle for her life had taken on a new meaning. The fight for survival was no longer just about cancer, it was about something much darker. She knew then that her life would never be the same. The woman she had been was gone, and the woman she was becoming was something far more dangerous, far more determined. Catherine Harris was no longer just fighting cancer. She was fighting for her dignity, for her pride, for everything she had once believed in. And David would pay the price. The discovery of David's betrayal was more than just a shocking revelation for Catherine, it was the spark that ignited a fire inside her, a fire fueled not by desperation, but by a deep, seething desire for revenge. The betrayal was not only emotional but also deeply personal. She had given David everything, her love, her trust, her devotion, and in return, he had abandoned her at her most vulnerable moment. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt the weight of what it meant to truly be alone. The weeks that followed the discovery were marked by a chilling quiet. Catherine did not confront David immediately, though the thought of doing so gnawed at her constantly. She knew she had no strength left to face him. Her body was still ravaged by the chemotherapy, and she wasn't sure she could withstand the confrontation, emotionally or physically. But she didn't need to confront him, not yet. Catherine's mind was already working, calculating, forming a plan that would strike at the very core of David's life, and it would be far more devastating than any confrontation could ever be. She started by observing David more closely. She watched how easily he lied, how smoothly he carried on with his daily life, pretending nothing had changed. He would come home late, often smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and offer her weak excuses, the same ones that had been so easy to swallow in the past. Now, they tasted bitter. Catherine knew she could never let him walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. The anger inside her was slow to build but fierce. Each day, as her strength began to return, so did her resolve. She wasn't just going to confront him or leave him. No, Catherine wanted to destroy him. She wanted to strip him of everything that mattered to him, his career, his wealth, his reputation, and make him feel the same sense of devastation that she had experienced. If she couldn't have his love and loyalty, she would make sure he lost everything else. The first part of her plan was deceptively simple: she would start by cutting him off from their shared financial resources. For years, they had operated with joint accounts, and Catherine had always trusted him to manage their finances. But now, the idea of him having control over their money made her skin crawl. So, she began to make small, subtle withdrawals, siphoning money into a private account he didn't know about. Each withdrawal, no matter how small, gave her a feeling of power, a sense that she was no longer the helpless woman caught in a web of deceit. With every transaction, Catherine regained a small piece of control over her own life, and it was exhilarating. But money wasn't enough. Catherine knew that David's greatest pride wasn't just his wealth, it was his career. As a corporate executive, David had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks, and his position gave him influence and power. Catherine's plan was to destroy that, too. She knew that Lily Ford, the woman David had been having an affair with, was one of his clients, someone who had interacted with him professionally for months. This, Catherine realized, was the key to his undoing. If she could expose their affair to his company, she could ruin his reputation, not just with her, but with everyone he worked with. She began gathering evidence, quietly compiling text messages, emails, and photos, anything that would expose the affair in a way that would be undeniable. Catherine's mind raced with possibilities as she prepared to strike. She wasn't just going to confront David, she was going to take him down. She knew that if she played her cards right, she could destroy his career without him ever suspecting that she was the one behind it. The idea of doing this, of hurting him in the way he had hurt her, filled her with a strange, cold satisfaction. But Catherine wasn't done yet. The most important part of her plan would come later. By the time she was ready to make her final move, she would be physically stronger, more resilient. The cancer treatment had drained her, but she could feel herself slowly returning to life, gaining back her energy, her strength, and her focus. Catherine's mind was sharp now. She thought through every detail, every step. She had spent years living in the shadows of her husband's success, supporting him and their family. Now, she was stepping into the light, reclaiming control of her life in the most calculated, deliberate way. David had no idea what was coming for him. Every day, Catherine watched David closely, observing the way he interacted with their children, the way he came home from work, the way he pretended like everything was fine. But nothing would be the same again. She could see the cracks in his facade, but he didn't know that she was the one who was about to break him. The first part of her plan was already in motion. With each withdrawal, with each piece of evidence gathered, Catherine felt more powerful. But she knew it wasn't enough. She had to destroy him completely, take everything he held dear. She was no longer the wife who had trusted and loved him unconditionally. She was a woman scorned, and she was ready to make sure David Harris would never forget the price of his betrayal. The pieces were falling into place, and Catherine was ready to strike. The quiet moments of contemplation had passed, now it was time for action. David would pay for what he had done. Catherine had prepared for this moment for months. Every detail had been carefully planned, every move calculated with precision. Her body had grown stronger since the chemotherapy treatments ended, and with her physical recovery came a sharpness in her mind that matched her newfound resolve. She had spent endless hours gathering evidence, moving money, and carefully orchestrating the downfall of David's world. Now, it was time for the final act. The plan had been simple at first: undermine David's career and his financial security, exposing his betrayal to his colleagues, and watching his life unravel. But as Catherine's anger grew, so did her desire for something more. She wanted to strip him of everything: his pride, his career, his dignity. She wanted him to feel the weight of the betrayal that she had felt every day since discovering his affair with Lily Ford. David had no idea what was coming. He had been oblivious to Catherine's quiet preparations, believing he was in control. But Catherine was no longer the woman he had once known. The woman who had supported him through every challenge was gone, replaced by someone colder, someone with a purpose that had nothing to do with love or forgiveness. Catherine's thoughts were no longer clouded by the fear of her illness or the pain of her suffering. Instead, they were focused on one thing: revenge. It all came to a head on the evening of June 25, 2020. Catherine had meticulously set the stage. The house was spotless, the table set with their best dinnerware. It had been months since she had made David's favorite meal, but tonight, she cooked it with the precision of a surgeon. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of the candlelight that flickered on the dining table. Everything was perfect. Everything was planned. David arrived home late, as usual, his steps heavy on the front porch. The stress of his affair, combined with the mounting pressure from his company, had taken its toll. His late nights had become more frequent as his work began to investigate the rumors of his misconduct with Lily. But he didn't know it was Catherine who had set those wheels in motion. He had no idea how far she had gone to ruin him, and he would never know until it was too late. Catherine greeted him at the door with a smile, one that seemed to say, "Everything's fine." But beneath the calm exterior was a heart pounding with anticipation. She was a master of control now, no longer the woman consumed by illness or self-doubt. She was the woman who would bring him to his knees. Dinner was served, and David, thinking this was a rare opportunity to mend things between them, was eager to talk. He had grown guilt-ridden over the past few weeks, sensing that something was wrong, that Catherine was no longer the woman he had married. He apologized again, but Catherine's words were calculated, measured. She didn't lash out or show anger. Instead, she asked him about his day, about work, about their children. Her calm demeanor only seemed to make David feel more at ease. He didn't notice the quiet tension that lay just beneath the surface. After dinner, as they sat sipping their drinks, Catherine made a suggestion. "Let's have a drink together," she said softly, her voice laced with a sweetness that almost seemed comforting. It was a simple gesture, but Catherine had planned it all. As she made the drinks, she slipped a sedative into his glass, just enough to make him fall into a deep, uncontrollable sleep. She had done her research, and she knew exactly how much it would take to bring him to the point of helplessness. David, tired and worn out from his constant worry, took a sip without a second thought. They talked for a while, but Catherine noticed his eyelids growing heavy, his words slowing. Within minutes, he slumped forward, unconscious in his chair. Catherine remained calm, unfazed. Her heart didn't race. She didn't feel panic or hesitation. This was it. The man who had shattered her life was now at her mercy. Catherine stood and walked to the kitchen, her footsteps silent, her breathing steady. She had planned this moment for so long, and now it was time to carry out the final step. In the garage, she had retrieved the hammer earlier that evening, knowing it would be the tool that would seal his fate. As she held it in her hands, the weight of it felt natural, as if it had always belonged there. She returned to the living room, standing over David's unconscious form. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, the father of her children, he was now nothing more than a vulnerable figure in her control. The first blow landed with a sickening thud, and Catherine didn't flinch. Blood splattered across the floor, staining the pristine tiles she had so carefully cleaned earlier. The sound of the hammer striking his skull echoed through the house, but it was as if Catherine were in a different world. There was no regret, no sorrow, just a cold, calculated satisfaction. She hit him again. And again. Each strike felt like a release, as though she were breaking the chains that had bound her to the past, to the love that had betrayed her. By the time she stopped, David's body lay motionless on the floor, a broken shell of the man who had once been everything to her. His blood pooled beneath him, a grotesque reflection of the marriage that had been destroyed. Catherine stood over him, breathing heavily, her grip on the hammer still firm. The finality of what she had done settled over her like a heavy fog, but there was no fear. There was no regret. Only the satisfaction of knowing that she had taken back control, she had taken back her power. Catherine left the hammer on the floor beside David's body, his lifeless eyes staring up at her. She walked calmly to the phone and dialed 911, her voice steady as she informed them that she had found David unresponsive in the kitchen. There was no panic, no rush. Just the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally brought justice to herself, in the most devastating way imaginable. As the police arrived, Catherine knew the truth would come out. Her life, her carefully constructed world, would never be the same. But in that moment, she felt at peace. She had taken everything from David. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now, she had made him pay for his betrayal. And there was no turning back. The silence in the house was deafening as Catherine sat in the dimly lit living room, her heart thudding in her chest. The events that had just unfolded felt almost surreal. She had taken the life of the man who had betrayed her, but there was no turning back now. She had planned every detail, every step, but deep down, she knew the calm demeanor she had shown so far would soon be tested. The police were on their way. As the flashing lights of the patrol cars illuminated the quiet street outside, Catherine felt a strange sense of detachment. The officers would arrive, investigate, and slowly piece together the details of what had happened. But she had done everything she could to make sure the truth would remain hidden, for now. When the first officer stepped into the house, Catherine stood up and greeted him with a steady voice, almost too calm. She told him that she had found David, her husband, unresponsive in the kitchen after he had apparently fallen. She gave no sign of panic, no indication of distress, as though this was just another ordinary occurrence. Her eyes, however, betrayed nothing, no guilt, no fear, only a strange sense of resolve. The officer seemed to notice her composure, but he did not question it. At that moment, there was no reason to suspect foul play. The detectives arrived shortly afterward, entering the house with practiced professionalism. They immediately noted the bloodstains on the kitchen floor, the chaos of the scene. Catherine calmly explained that David must have tripped and hit his head, and that she had immediately called for help when she found him. She spoke in a measured tone, carefully avoiding any emotional outbursts, despite the horror of the situation. As the investigators began their examination, Catherine continued to maintain her calm facade, answering their questions with precision. But in her mind, she was already anticipating their next steps. She had taken great care to make sure there were no obvious signs that pointed directly to her. She had cleaned up the blood as best she could, ensuring that no evidence of a struggle remained. The hammer, still covered in David's blood, had been left behind for the investigators to find. Catherine knew they would wonder about it, but she was confident that they would chalk it up to a freak accident. The story she had woven was foolproof, or so she thought. However, despite her careful planning, something about the scene felt off to the detectives. The blood spatter on the kitchen floor didn't quite add up. The force of the head injury seemed too severe for a simple fall, and the bruising around David's skull suggested something far more violent. Catherine noticed the way the detectives exchanged glances as they reviewed the scene, but she didn't let her nerves show. She was still in control, at least, that's what she told herself. As they began to inspect the rest of the house, the police quickly discovered a few inconsistencies that raised their suspicions. The family's bank accounts had been tampered with. Small withdrawals had been made over the past few weeks, money that Catherine had transferred into an account of her own, money that David knew nothing about. The detectives noted the strange timing of these transactions, and though there was no direct evidence linking Catherine to them, the timing seemed suspicious. Catherine's calm demeanor began to work against her. In her interviews, her lack of visible grief or panic was noted. She spoke about David in a detached way, as if he were a distant figure in her life, not the man she had spent years with. When questioned further about the events leading up to David's death, she was evasive, offering explanations that didn't fully make sense. She didn't break down in tears as they might have expected. Instead, she gave a steady, almost rehearsed account of what had happened. The turning point came when the officers discovered the hammer in her closet, hidden away, still stained with blood. The murder weapon was right there, under her possession. The investigators quickly realized that the severity of David's injuries, combined with the blood spatter at the scene, indicated a deliberate act. Catherine's story, that David had simply fallen, began to unravel. Within days, the police had pieced together a timeline that didn't align with Catherine's version of events. They learned that David had been having an affair with Lily Ford, a client of his at the company. Catherine's investigation had exposed the affair long before the police could connect the dots, and now, with the hammer and the financial records, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident was now looking more and more like a carefully orchestrated murder. The detectives dug deeper into Catherine's history, and soon, they uncovered the withdrawals from the joint bank accounts, withdrawals that had been made to fund Catherine's plan to take everything from David, from his money to his career, and ultimately, his life. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that this was no crime of passion, it was a calculated, premeditated act. Catherine had not acted out of anger in a single moment of fury. Instead, she had methodically planned David's downfall over the course of weeks. She had set the stage for his ruin, dismantling his life piece by piece, all while he was none the wiser. As Catherine's story began to crumble under the weight of the evidence, the detectives focused on the final piece of the puzzle, the call Catherine had made to her lawyer the day before David's death. The timing of the call, coupled with the meticulous planning of her actions, made it clear that Catherine had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Her carefully constructed life had been a facade, hiding the dark, vengeful woman who had plotted the death of her husband. It was only a matter of time before Catherine was arrested. The detectives had the evidence, and they knew the truth. The woman who had once been seen as a grieving wife had become, in the eyes of the law, a cold-blooded killer, a woman who had sacrificed everything for revenge. The courtroom was filled with people eager to witness the trial of Catherine Harris, a woman once seen as a loving wife and mother, now accused of the brutal murder of her husband, David. The case had captivated the nation, drawing attention not only because of the shocking nature of the crime but also because of Catherine's cold, composed demeanor throughout the investigation. The same woman who had been battling cancer, a seemingly fragile and vulnerable figure, was now facing the most harrowing moment of her life, the moment when her calculated revenge would be laid bare for the world to see. As Catherine sat in the defendant's chair, her face remained impassive, her hands folded in her lap. The public perception of her had shifted dramatically. Once, she had been admired for her strength in the face of illness, a woman who had endured more than most could imagine. But now, the woman who had been loved and sympathized with was seen through a different lens. She was the accused, a killer, and the tragic victim of her own vengeance. Her appearance, once radiant and full of life, now seemed almost hollow. Her face was pale, her eyes steely, betraying nothing. If the pain of losing her family, her husband, and ultimately her freedom was eating away at her, it was impossible to tell. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Catherine as a cold, calculating woman who had planned the murder of her husband for months. They described in vivid detail how she had orchestrated her revenge, from the careful withdrawals of money from their joint accounts to the meticulous gathering of evidence that would destroy David's career. They outlined how Catherine had used her illness, her vulnerability, as a shield, while secretly plotting the destruction of the man she had once loved. The affair with Lily Ford, they argued, had been the catalyst that had pushed Catherine over the edge. She had never truly forgiven David for betraying her trust, even as she fought to survive her own battle with cancer. The prosecution highlighted the premeditation in Catherine's actions, pointing to the sedative she had slipped into David's drink, the hammer she had used to strike him down, and the cold, calculated manner in which she had planned every step. Catherine's financial manipulations and the hidden bank accounts were also central to their argument, painting a picture of a woman who had used her illness as a disguise to carry out her revenge. The defense, however, argued that Catherine had been pushed to the brink by overwhelming emotional and physical pain. They claimed that her actions had been driven not by malice, but by desperation, a woman who had been betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect and love her. The defense attorneys focused heavily on Catherine's cancer diagnosis, the immense toll it had taken on her body and mind, and the emotional devastation she had suffered after discovering David's affair. They argued that the affair, coupled with her declining health, had caused Catherine to snap, pushing her to commit a crime she could never have otherwise imagined. Catherine's mental state, the defense contended, had been severely compromised by her illness. They painted her as a victim, a woman who had been broken not only by her disease but also by the man she had trusted more than anyone else in the world. The defense called on expert witnesses to testify that Catherine's emotional distress, coupled with the physical and psychological toll of cancer, had caused her to temporarily lose her ability to reason and think clearly. They urged the jury to see her not as a murderer, but as a woman who had been driven to an extreme by forces beyond her control. As the trial went on, Catherine remained stoic, her face an unreadable mask. She listened to the testimony, but inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She was unable to escape the nagging sense of guilt that lingered beneath her calm exterior. She had planned every detail, every move, and had felt a cold satisfaction as she carried out her revenge, but now, in the face of the trial, she couldn't ignore the overwhelming weight of what she had done. Her mind often returned to the moment she had taken David's life, the moment when she had struck him with the hammer. She remembered the blood, the feeling of the hammer in her hand, and the absence of any remorse in those first moments. At the time, she had felt empowered, as if she had taken control of her life again. But now, as she sat in the courtroom, facing the consequences of her actions, a bitter realization began to set in. No matter what the defense argued, no matter how much she tried to justify her actions, she had killed him. The man she had loved for years, the father of her children, was gone, and she had taken his life. The guilt was suffocating, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. She couldn't face the truth of who she had become. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution painted Catherine as a woman who had meticulously dismantled her husband's life, using his infidelity as an excuse to destroy everything he had worked for. They argued that Catherine had orchestrated his downfall with cold precision, showing no remorse for her actions. To them, she wasn't just a victim of betrayal, she was a woman who had plotted a cold-blooded murder. But in the quiet moments before the verdict was read, Catherine's thoughts turned inward. She thought of David, of their life together, the love they once shared, and the slow, insidious poison of betrayal that had eroded their marriage. She thought of her children, the family she had torn apart in pursuit of revenge. The reality of her actions weighed heavily on her. This was no longer about justice, this was about the irreversible consequence of her choices. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned with a verdict, Catherine braced herself. The outcome was as she had expected, yet it still felt like a crushing blow. She was found guilty of second-degree murder, her mental state having been taken into account by the jury, but they still believed she was fully responsible for David's death. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. As the gavel came down, Catherine felt the weight of the decision settle over her. She had planned and carried out her revenge with precision, but now she had to face the reality of her actions. She was no longer a victim of betrayal or cancer, she was a murderer, forever bound to the consequences of her own choices. And in that moment, she realized that the true punishment wasn't the sentence handed down by the court. It was the knowledge that she would carry the burden of her actions for the rest of her life. The courtroom buzzed with the noise of reporters packing up their gear, the verdict now delivered and the drama unfolding before them fading into a somber reality. As Catherine was escorted out of the courtroom, her thoughts were jumbled and heavy, yet strangely empty. The gavel had come down, and her fate was sealed. She had taken revenge on the man who had betrayed her in the most brutal way, and now she had to pay the price. The life she had known, her family, her home, her future, had evaporated into nothingness. The media would run stories about her for days, the headline reading, "Cancer patient kills husband in cold-blooded revenge plot." People would debate whether her actions were justified, whether the pain of betrayal and her illness could ever excuse such a violent response. But Catherine knew the truth. There was no justification for what she had done. Revenge, no matter how sweet it had seemed in the moment, had left her with nothing but regret and loss. As the police led her away, her mind wandered back to those first days after her diagnosis, when her world had seemed so full of promise. She had fought hard against the cancer, hoping to come out of it stronger, perhaps with a renewed sense of love and partnership with David. But instead, she found herself facing a dark, bitter path that had consumed her in ways she never anticipated. The woman she had been, the loving wife, the devoted mother, was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable to her own heart. Catherine's thoughts then turned to her children. What would they think when they grew older? Would they understand why their mother had done what she did? Could they ever forgive her for the choice she had made? The guilt weighed heavily on her. The family she had once protected with all her strength was now broken beyond repair, and she had to live with the consequences. She knew, deep down, that the prison sentence she was serving would be a lifelong punishment, but the real punishment was the truth she had to face every day. The betrayal she had experienced, the pain she had endured, had led her to make a choice that could never be undone. The price of her revenge was not just the years in prison, it was the destruction of everything she had held dear. As Catherine sat in her prison cell, a strange peace began to settle over her. She had taken back control of her life in the most devastating way possible, but what had she really gained? She had only lost everything she once loved. The realization dawned on her: revenge had not been the answer. It had not healed the wounds that betrayal had caused. In the end, it had only created deeper scars. There was no way to undo the past, no way to take back the choices she had made. And now, as she faced the future, all she could do was wonder if there could ever be redemption for her. Would she ever find peace with herself? Could she ever atone for what she had done? These questions, with no clear answers, would haunt her for the rest of her life. But for now, Catherine was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions, the irreversible path she had walked down, and the reality of what it meant to be a woman consumed by revenge. Her story would end in the prison walls that now encased her, but it would serve as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked anger, the destructive power of betrayal, and the deep, unforgiving scars that are left behind when one chooses vengeance over healing. What do you think about this story? Was Catherine justified in her actions, or did her quest for revenge go too far? What would you have done in her shoes? Leave your comments below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this. Your feedback helps us bring more compelling content to you every week.